very last few seconds because I was thinking, well, is I had just answered it was dependent on Q for one of my questions. I had to type in, I wrote the letter Q. And I thought, well, Q's blood flow. And so I thought, well, this says absence of blood flow, and that's what threw me off. So I just totally missed and got it wrong, but that was my thinking.
Do you understand it now? Do you understand what I'm after?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
intrinsic clearance, it's important for you to understand that intrinsic clearance is really a theoretical thing for hepatic clearance. It's enzyme activity. And there can be really, really high enzyme activity that you're never going to reach physiologically. And it certainly isn't going to, it's going to be higher than your body clearance can be because we're limited by blood flow, right? Oh, the highest that any clearance can be of any organ is blood flow. Right? So intrinsic clearance is different than that. Intrinsic clearance is the intrinsic ability of whatever organ to actually clear the drug. And for the liver, it's enzyme activity. And then we can go one step even further and say, well, what determines the enzyme activity, right? And that's our Michaelis-Menten equation of Vmax divided by Km plus C, right? Is going to be your intrinsic clearance. And I didn't even ask you to go that far, of course, but really that's the definition of intrinsic clearance, is being able to eliminate the drug or clear the drug in the liver without any restriction of blood flow and without any restriction of binding, because those are the two things that are going to slow it down, right? So I don't know why this one was so hard, but it was. And maybe it was because of the order, I don't know. And maybe it's because your brain couldn't even function after all those calculations.
At that point, I was tore all to pieces.
Actually, this was my first question, and I had to come back to it because I was confused from the wording. But it was my first question.
But if you go back and look at the slides, hopefully it's very clear, because I think
I went to the slides and it confused me a little bit more. That's why I put I went to the slides afterwards and I thought, well, it has to be right because it doesn't seem true. But then it turned out that I was wrong.
I didn't even have time to go back to questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you.
This was a multiple, this was just a click. So I went back to it and clicked.
Oh, I'm sorry that wasn't clear even after you went to the slides. That worries
Well,
me.
after I finished the test, I went to go look for this question because I wasn't sure.
My OCD makes me.
And I did find it in the slides. I found it in the slides, and that's why I didn't think it made sense with what the slide was saying. Does that make because this question really it bothered me.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean.
It wasn't.
I need to fix it, but I don't know how to say it any differently.
Yeah.
That intrinsic clearance is the intrinsic ability of the liver to clear drug without any limitations of the blood coming in or it being stuck to a protein.
I think it's the maximal part.
And I think it's the drug flow, like the maximal and the absence, because it says without limitations, but to me, without limitations doesn't mean that there's no blood flow. In my head, I'm like, if there's no blood flow, you're dead. There is no intrinsic clearance. Like, I'm
like you're dead.
That's it. You, I hope you're fine.
Maybe I should say it's the theoretical. Would that have been better?
Yeah.
I mean,
change maximal to theoretical.
Yeah, I was hung up on the word maximal. And so when I went back to check it after the test on the slides, it doesn't really say that on the slides in that manner. So I was like, okay, then I think I'm in the clear.
All right, you got me. I'm going to change it.
And you see, for me, with the absence, I'm like, the person is dead. There is no clearance. I mean, I hope they clear the gates of heaven, but that's all the clearance.
I think I'm going to change maximal to theoretical.
Maybe it also just needs changed in the slides too.
Yeah.
Like not to be word for word the same thing as a question you would ask, but to clarify a little bit.
Idea always, you know what I mean? If you have the idea of, I think of you lopping off a piece of liver and plopping it somewhere where blood flow isn't an issue, and it's in a protein-free solution, which isn't possible because liver has protein in it. But I mean, protein can't be limiting it, you know? So that's kind of how I think about it. At the end of the day, it's really just the enzyme activity for a liver. And if you're talking about renal clearance, the intrinsic clearance of tubular secretion is the activity of those transportation I can't think of a word right now, but the transporters that move the drug from the blood into the urine.
Dr. Earle, say that then. What you just said. That's perfect. Say that then.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe I just want to ask this question again.
No, it's fine to have a difficult question, but what you just said is a better explanation
Yeah.
than what I had in my head
Honestly,
before the
This is
exam,
the
during,
only
and
one that I
after.
got right on the test.
honestly, I think this question was answered at a very high rate in the past. So I must not have good stuff for you guys, or the in-class kids missed it too. So I don't know. I must not have emphasized it enough this year or something.
I keep saying that I thought the patient was dead. There's no blood flow.
And to be honest, I feel like your part was like weeks, months ago, and like all I had,
Honestly, you know, everybody did poorly on much more poorly than I would have expected on my questions, but not really when I considered how long ago it was, and it was only 15% of the exam. So if I were preparing, I would have blown this stuff off. I know not all of you did. I know probably you got a lot of you guys are very good students, but I would have been like worried more about the 85% than the 15 because you're strategic, right? I mean,
yep, that's what I did. I'm so sorry.
don't
So I'm
be
glad you're going to
sorry.
go over it.
No, you're just being a good student. You're being smart. You're playing the odds, you know, but anyway, that's the answer to that one. And I will fix that question. All right. Next one. Can you see this? The maximum clearance of any organ is
You. I'm gonna guess this one had a good, whatever you called it, score. I can't even think of the name of it.
Everybody had a different way of saying it, but a lot of people got it right. But some people put 1, some people put, there was a lot of 90 liters per hour, which is true if I would have said liver. But I want you to understand that any organ of clearance, whether it's your, you know, there's other, you know, the your bile, if it's your secretion, anything like that, the fastest it can be is the blood flow to that organ. If you find out, you know, that your earlobes clear drug, the fastest it can ever be is the clearance to that organ.
And the clearance is Q? Or the blood flow to the organ is Q?
Yes. Yeah, because it's always Q times E, right? It's always the blood flow to the organ and then the efficiency of that organ to be able to extract drug, which is E, right? Extraction efficiency, the percentage of drug that gets eliminated. So Q times E is always the clearance of any organ. Q times E. And the biggest, we know E is between 0 and 1. It's a percentage, right? So the biggest that any clearance can be is Q. Right? Does everybody get that?
So the answer was 1 or
the
2?
maximum clearance of the liver. You could have still said Q, but if you said 90 liters per hour, I would have given you credit for that. Because that's a normal Q, right?
So the answer was Q, right?
Yeah, or you could say blood flow to the organ, or you could say Q, or anything, you know. There were a lot of things. You guys are very clever coming up with different ways of wording it, but I think this was pretty well. I don't remember what the statistics were, but I think it's pretty good. Questions about that one?
I think that one's straight from the PowerPoint.
Good. All right, your patient's on drug C. So here's drug C. Let's look at it quickly. So what do we know? We know the hepatic clearance is 87 liters per hour. We know the fraction unbound is 0.34. We know the FE. What does FE mean again? What does Dr. Basu call this?
Nothing.
I need,
Nothing.
I guess
Never
I need to
mentioned it.
change all my stuff because he's never going to, but you know, I got a lot more material to change than he does. So.
Fe is the percentage that is cleared by the kidney.
Exactly. So it's fraction excreted unchanged in the urine. So it's the fraction of drug that ends up in the urine. So
I
if
kept
Fe
saying
is
that
0,
yesterday.
none of it's ending up in the urine. Therefore, we assume it's all being cleared by the liver. That may or may not be true, but for our purposes, we're going to assume Fe of 0 means that it's totally cleared by the liver, which means this is total body clearance, doesn't it? For all these drugs. Does that make sense to everybody?
Well, it does in retrospect.
So.
You
your
said it means
specific-
the FE means that it's totally cleared by the liver.
If
The
F-
0.
If
Well,
FE
FE
is
was
0.
0.
Fe
Yeah.
is 0. If Fe is 1, what does that tell you? That's what you're going to see this week, right?
Totally cleared by the kidneys.
kidney.
Yeah.
By the kidney. All right, you good, Sherry? All right. This tells you which enzyme system is clearing. Since they're all hepatically cleared, here's the predominant CYP system that's clearing the drug. And here's by which route's given. So I do this so I can write a bunch of different questions with the same data, basically. It's just so right away when you see C, you know you don't have to pay attention to any of these. So we know this drug is cleared by the liver. Its hepatic clearance is 87 liters per hour. So is this a high or a low extraction drug?
High extraction?
Time.
And you say that more confidently, please. I don't know who said that.
I don't want to say it more confidently. I'm not confident. I just
High
did
question
math
mark.
and thought it was high
Then we'll
extraction
talk
on the
about-
test.
Know that without even doing any calculations.
It's high extraction because it's close to Q of 90.
Right, Roman. Is it closer to Q or is it closer to 0?
Q.
Closer to Q.
Well, it's approaching Q, isn't it? So the way we figure out we know that clearance is equal to Q times E, right?
Yeah. It was on the
Clearance
equation
is
sheet.
87 liters per hour. And if we assume a normal Q of 90 liters per hour, what's our E going to be? It's going to be 87 divided by 90, which I think is approaching 1, right? 87 divided by 90 is 0.97. So it's definitely a high extraction drug, right? The E is 0.97, which is very unusual. This is a very high extraction drug, isn't it? So what does that mean? That means that clearance is approximated by Q. What else does it mean? It means if it's given orally, I probably need to get out. I need to change this thing here. Hang on a minute. Let me move this to here. Can you still see this?
No.
No. Okay.
No, it went to
We
some
see your
other box.
PDFs though.
Right. Can you still see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can
but
hear
there's
you.
we
But
can
we're definitely seeing somebody's
information that we probably
Recommendation.
that we probably shouldn't be seeing. Yeah.
All right. Can you see me now?
yes.
I had to pull my thing off because I want to be able to. What did you see? Something that somebody was in good standing? I apologize for that. I think it's nothing bad, but all right. Can you see the thing now or no?
No.
Okay, hang on. I want to be able to write on this, so. All right, how about now?
Yes.
So. I get a whiteboard on this thing. Oh, annotate. Okay, do that. All right. So if we know okay. So if we know that I'm just gonna try to find a white space on here to. Here's my explanation. If we know that since we have a high E drug, the clearance is approximated by Q, and that the fraction that escapes the first pass effect is Q over intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound, and this fraction unbound is going to be seen by the liver as 1 because it's non-restrictively cleared. How do we know it's non-restrictively cleared? Well, we can compare our E to our fraction unbound. Our fraction unbound is like 0.34, I think. And didn't we decide our E was 0.98 or something crazy like that? So more is being extracted than is free, right? So it's non-restrictively cleared. So the liver sees really it all as being free, doesn't it?
Mm.
All right, so what's our question again? Let me just erase. Well, do I have to just stop that for a minute? Our question is, a CYP2D6 inhibitor was added. All right, a CYP2D6 inhibitor was added. So what is that telling us? What's CYP2D6? It's the enzyme, right? So if it's being inhibited, what is that telling us?
That more drugs going to go through.
Well,
Nothing
it tells us
blocking
that
it.
our enzymes are decreased, right? We're inhibiting those enzymes.
So more drug in the system because it does not get metabolized.
Well, not necessarily, because what's our clearance dependent upon?
The blood flow.
Blood flow. We haven't changed that,
Um,
but we have decreased enzyme activity. Therefore, our bioavailability is going to go up, isn't it? If we're giving it orally. If we were giving it IV, we wouldn't expect any change in the bioavailability because none of this would have mattered. But let's see what we get for our CSS average. So our CSS average is going to be bioavailable dose rate all over clearance, right? And we know that our clearance, sorry, I don't have room on my little screen. Our clearance is going to be equal to what? Q, right? It's determined by Q. Right? And our bioavailability is determined by FA. I gotta erase more of this. FG. We don't want to forget about FA and FG because they're still important, aren't they? And FH. And FH is determined by Q over intrinsic clearance times that weird fraction unbound that I'm not even going to worry about right now, times dose rate, and that's our CSS average. Now, do we need to look at free concentration? Because really that's what we're interested in, is what happens to free concentration, right? At least that's what I'm interested in. Why are we interested in free concentration? Because that's the active form, right? If the drug is bound to a protein, it can't interact with the receptor, right? You with me? So
Yes.
do we need to look at free in this case? What's happened? Well, we've had this change in intrinsic clearance. Have we had a change in binding? Not that we know of, right? We haven't been told about a change in binding. So we don't need to look at free concentration. Total will be fine. Remember, the only time that free concentration and total concentration are going to be different as far as whether it's going up or down, is when there's been a binding change. Has there been a binding change here? Not that we know of. So we can look at total concentration and determine what's going to happen with free. If we wanted free, we'd have to just multiply this times fraction unbound. I'm running out of, why is that there? Go away. So what's happened? This intrinsic clearance has been decreased, right? So we've decreased the enzyme activity, which means our fraction that makes it through the liver is going to be more. A higher fraction. So this whole thing is going to increase, isn't it? Which is just like giving more drug. And it's particularly critical in a high extraction drug. Why is that? Because when very little of it's making it through the liver to begin with, even small changes are going to be larger magnitude changes in how much of it actually makes it through, which is basically what we're giving, what actually makes it to the systemic circulation. So we're going to see an increase in CSS average, aren't we?
I thought that you said that the FH was going up.
Yes.
So shouldn't that whole piece be going up? Which would then
this
make,
whole piece goes up.
okay, thank you.
Sorry, you can't see with all my scribbles. I can't believe it. Sorry, it's not the best situation. All right, so our CSS average will go up, not because there's been a change in clearance. It's because there's a change in bioavailability. All right, so now let's look at half-life to see if we want to make a change in our dose interval. So it's 0.693 volume over clearance. Clearance in this case is going to be approximated by Q, isn't it? And volume is really all about binding. And as far as we know, there's been no change in binding. And since the only thing that's really changed is our intrinsic clearance, that's not a determinant of half-life. So you shouldn't make any change in your dose interval, should you? So the answer is decreased dose rate, no change in dose interval.
Dr. Earle,
Yeah.
when you say there is no change in binding, why do we say that? Because we added inhibitors, so.
But the inhibitor is inhibiting the enzyme, not binding. It's not changing the protein binding. It's changing the enzymes, the number of enzymes available. Protein binding is a whole separate system.
And I thought if there is less, less enzyme, we have more free drug there.
Wait a minute. Wait, I can't hear you. Hang on. What did you say?
I thought if we have less enzymes, we have more free drug there.
Nope. Nope. Enzymes, the number of enzymes really is what affects intrinsic clearance. If you inhibit the enzymes, you're just changing enzyme activity. That's it. That's a separate issue from your
Those are liver enzymes, right?
Or binding to AAG or binding to the lipoproteins.
So when we talking about inhibitors or inducers of enzymes, it only applies when we talk about protein binding?
That is going to be separate from protein binding, yeah. Protein binding, if I say binding to albumin, binding AAG, then we're talking about protein binding changing. And remember, when you're bound to one of those proteins, it becomes inert. Whereas binding to, remember, the drug is in a tug of war between the binding and the enzyme when we're talking about hepatic clearance, right? It's sort of a tug of war. If the drug is bound to a protein like albumin or AAG, it's protected. If it's restrictive clearance, it's protected from being cleared by the enzyme. In non-restrictive clearance, it's not protected. But because there's a change in enzyme, in the amount of enzyme or the attraction of the enzyme, that doesn't affect protein binding. Protein binding is about the KD, the number of binding sites and the relative KD of the binding system, the relative affinity for the binding system. They're two separate things. They're both fighting for drug though. Does that help or make it worse?
Kind of helps.
Okay. Any
you.
questions about that one before we move on?
You know your explanation on the side? It's for a different problem, right? It doesn't match
Yeah.
up with this one.
I probably was copying problems and didn't look at the explanation.
Yeah, because that's about a low extraction drug, and that is not what we just did here.
Yeah, I don't release those anymore because they're, yeah.
No, that's fine. I was just reading along to see if it
Oh,
would
good. I mean, I'm glad
would
you thought
provide
that was
any
the right thing. I'll
elucidation to
erase-
any of
I'll
this.
fix that too.
Yeah.
I tend to make a question and then I write a bunch of different variations of it, at once.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
All right. I have to get rid of that. Wait, no, I don't want to do that yet. And clear that. And then I'm going to do that.
So it was supposed to be decrease the dose rate and make no change to the dosing interval, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And I
I
did allow you to do one or the other. Usually when it comes to dosing, I want you to get them both right. But when I saw the grades, I decided to be a little lenient on that. So if you got one right, you got half the credit.
guess the reason I ask is because I don't recall us going through this in very much detail. So perhaps for next round of going through hepatic clearance for
This is what the
people.
homework and
I
what it's all
I
about.
don't remember this something like this being on the homework though, that it just changed the enzyme
There were some
capacity.
I think
maybe
we
not
did
homework
something
but
similar.
workshop. I don't remember what's on the workshop or homework, but yeah, there's questions.
Maybe I don't remember it because I remember having to do both the dosing interval and the dose rate, even though only one of them is really being changed. Maybe that's why I don't remember
Maybe.
seeing it this
There's
way.
also some practice problems in that, preparation for, that big list of questions. There's questions in there you can practice too. If you
What
want.
big list of questions?
It's in exam prep. There's a list of like 100 questions that go through all the stuff that I teach, and some of them you won't have to know because we're not doing multi-compartmental. But I'll put a note to remind you where those are. Wait, what all am I saying I'm gonna do? I gotta write this down. Readings. Practice problems. Gotta fix some of these questions. All right, next one. All right, drug X exhibits restrictive or non-restrictive clearance. Okay, so let's look at drug X. Drug X, both of these FE is 0, which means they're cleared by the liver, which makes sense because these are liver clearance questions. Pretty highly protein bound, yeah, both of these. Bound to albumin. Total body clearance is 72 liters. So it's totally cleared by the liver. So is this a high or a low extraction drug? Closer to 90 or closer to 0? Closer
to 90.
Yeah, so it's a high extraction. Let's see, 72 divided by 90, 0.8. I guess I should have done that in my head. 0.8 for the extraction ratio, so that's a high extraction drug. And you could have maybe guessed it because look at that bioavailability. We know that high extraction drugs are going to have a relatively low bioavailability, right? Because we know the FH is going to be relatively small because the E is big, right? So in this case, the FH is only 20%. Only 20% is making it through. So it's not just FH, but the FG must also be pretty low. But that's neither here nor there. So is this restrictive or non-restrictive? Well, well, I tell you, all high E drugs are going to be non-restrictive. But again, the E we figured out is 0.8, and what's available for clearance that's unbound, right? Or I'm sorry, what's the fraction unbound is only 15%. but 80% is being cleared. So is this restrictive or non-restrictive? Is it restricted to clearing only free drug?
No, that's non-restrictive like the last
That is
one.
non-restrictive big time, right? Only 15% is free, but 80% is being eliminated, is being extracted, is being cleared. So yeah, it's totally non-restrictive. And we also know that high extraction drugs are usually are non-restrictively cleared. So this is a non-restrictive drug because E is much greater than the fraction unbound, right? So it has to be greater than. The answer should be greater than. I did give credit for greater than or equal to, but really the answer is greater than. Drug Y, on the other hand, let's see, its fraction unbound is 20%. It's bound to AAG, but it has a clearance of 12.7. It's totally cleared by the liver. 12.7 liters per hour. That's closer to 0. What's 12.7 divided by 90? It's 14%. So 14% is the extraction ratio. So E is 0.41. E is 0.14, I mean, right? And the fraction unbound is 20%, is 0.2. So is the liver limited? Are the enzymes limited to being able to clear only free drug? Yes, because E is less than or equal to the fraction unbound, isn't it? 20% is free, 14% is being eliminated. So this is restrictive, isn't it? Restricted to only free drug, only unbound drug. So the answer for the second part of this, oops. Drug Y is restrictive and it's less than or equal to the fraction unbound. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, this guy, still on drug C. Now we have a decrease in Q. All right, so last time it was a decrease in intrinsic clearance. This time it's a decrease in Q. So let's work through that. So if we have a decrease in Q, that's what's happening. Is this a low E or high E drug? If you remember before, we figured out that it's a high E drug, so clearance is approximated by Q. And we have to be concerned about FH, which is Q over intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound, which is determined by fraction unbound is seen as 1 because this is a non-restrictively cleared drug. So what's going to happen with our CSS average? Well, it's bioavailable dose rate over clearance. Our clearance is approximated by Q, and our bioavailability is approximated by FA times FG times FH, which is Q over intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. The fraction unbound is equal to 1. Do we need to multiply this times fraction unbound in this case to figure out our free? Well, we can, but it's not necessary because as far as we know, there's no change in plasma protein binding, only a change in Q. So in this case, unlike the last one, so I'm going to just erase it just so I don't have to worry about it. This one, what's happened is a decrease in Q, so there's a decrease in clearance, isn't there? There's also the decrease in in Q also decreases FH. Right? So FH is decreasing and so is clearance, and those will, at steady state, it's decreasing drug in and it's decreasing drug out. So there's no change in CSS average for this particular interaction. So there's going to be no change in dose rate. That's, how about if it were given IV, it would be a different situation, right? Because we have route dependence. If it were IV, then we would see an increase in CSS average and need to decrease the dose rate. But because it's given PO, we have to worry about bioavailability, and the decrease in Q is going to affect both clearance and bioavailability. How about half-life? What are we going to need to make a dose rate change? Well, half-life is 0.693 volume over clearance. Clearance in this case is dependent upon Q. Sorry. And our binding is what's going to determine our volume. As far as we know, this hasn't changed, but our Q has decreased. So what's going to happen to our half-life? There's nothing to balance it here. So our half-life is going to increase. So we're going to need to increase our tau, aren't we? So what are you going to need to do for dose rate? That's incorrect. That's a mistake. I'll have to go back and check that.
It was supposed
That
to be
should be-
decrease the dose rate and increase the interval, right?
It should definitely be increase the dose rate, but is it given IV or PO?
I thought I had a question I asked about
Oh,
IV.
it's given IV. The last question, it was PO. So good, I don't have the key wrong. So I apologize. I did the wrong problem here. So I didn't read the whole thing, did I? So CSS average here, just like I said, we're not giving it orally, we're giving it IV. So it's just dose rate over clearance, pretty simple. Since clearance is dependent upon Q, Q is decreasing, so CSS average will increase and we will want to decrease the dose rate. If it were given orally, we wouldn't make a change, but since it's being given IV.
Okay.
Sorry
So I
about
get,
that.
no, that's okay. I
It was
remember this
PO
question.
before, right? I'm not
It
losing my
was-
mind.
No, it was PO before, because I remember on the exam, because I thought it was the exact same chart
Well,
at
me
first.
too. Me too.
And so
Again,
then I
it's
went back and I was
probably
like,
that I wrote a bunch of questions. Go ahead, sorry.
no, it's okay. I just remember I was like, wait, I thought it all said by PO, but this question's asking about, like IV. So then that's when I realized they were two different charts.
I was actually trying to make it easier for you, probably, because it's harder to do PO than IV, I think, but.
But anyway, back to the PO. If this question was PO,
Mm-hmm.
because the Q decreased and the FH decreased, then that bounces out and we make no changes in the CSS average. Is that what you said?
Right. That's exactly right. If it were given PO, we'd have a different attack on it. And that's the route difference, right? That's the route difference that we see with high extraction drugs. But since it's being given IV, you would decrease the dose rate. If we're given IV, no change in dose rate.
Okay, I got you now. Good point. I'm glad we went over that, even
I
though
didn't have the key wrong. That freaked me out a minute here, so. All right. Yeah, so if it were on another test and I gave you PO, I want you to be able to do any of those things, So that's it for my questions. Is my rationale right on this one? I don't know. Anyway. All right. So. I'm gonna stop that. Now the question is, do you want to move into some renal stuff or are you exhausted?